Hello, and welcome to Cloud Insiders, a podcast that brings cloud down to earth. Hello, and welcome to Cloud Insiders by Xtravirt. Today I'm joined by James Kilby, Senior Consultant at Xtravirt and a Veeam Vanguard. Hello there, James.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. If we just jump right in, today we're talking about data backup and protection. Modern organisations are dealing with huge amounts of information and critical data. They need to ensure it's always available and always well managed. So, James, how important is data backup and protection?
So, Veeam have got an interesting spin on this, and it's one that I quite like, and I'm going to jump in. Veeam wouldn't describe themselves as a data backup company. They're a data availability company. So, lots of companies will tell you they can back your data up and it's all good. But if you actually look at the industry statistics, there's still a significant percentage of backups fail to restore for one reason or another. And Veeam have sort of nailed the backup piece, but they've also given you some of the tools to ensure that in the event that you do need it, you can be confident that you can restore your data. So the primary sort of piece of technology on that is something called Sure Backup, which is where Veeam can instantiate a isolated network and restore your servers into that isolated network and perform a number of automated tests against them and give you a nice little report. And it's a great way of ensuring that if you do need your data, that it can be available. That's a big win for me.
So it's with that short backup, it's essentially you not only got a backup, but intermittently it checks that you'd be able to restore it at a moment's notice.
Exactly, yeah. So you can schedule that job so that it happens periodically, or you can tag it so that it happens after every backup, if you so wish. You can also, using that same technology, some larger customers will have a dedicated DR environment. They can use the same technology with Sure Replica to fire up the DR environment and again check it in a similar sort of way. So there are a number of automated tests built into that for checking things like Active Directory, DNS. I think it's got some Exchange checks. It's definitely got some SQL checks, or you can write some of your own tools. The other beauty of that technology is because it's taking your production environment and restoring it in an isolated way, you can actually use it for testing. So the first time I ever used that from a Veeam environment was when I was asked to look at a Microsoft Dynamics environment. There was a customer that wanted to do some upgrades. And what we actually did is we used the Veeam backups. They were already a Veeam customer. We created these Sure Backup jobs, and then we actually ran through the upgrade process across all of the servers within this isolated Sure Backup environment before we did it in production. And that allowed us to use that backup data, gain value from it. We could show the customer the exact steps that we were going to do, and it was using the previous night's backup. So we tweaked that process. We worked out exactly what to do in which order, and then we could prove to the customer that we could do it using their servers, their data, all ahead of touching their live systems.
I mean, yeah, that just sounds, absolutely, absolutely amazing. I mean, even in my limited capacity with databases and having to back things up and restore them, nothing ever works when you want it to. So having that knowledge that you just click away and it's done, that's invaluable.
Yeah, it is. It's one of my favourite and probably the least well marketed parts of the Veeam infrastructure, if you ask me.
Yeah. Okay. So we've covered off that it's mega important to keep your information backed up, but is it always fires and floods and attacks by bears, or is it often just something more mundane?
It can be mundane. I mean, like you say, you've covered off some of the headline issues, and sometimes that they do have to be covered. I mean, we've had Hurricane Sandy and other issues. Luckily in the UK, we don't get a lot of hurricanes, but I have seen a UK data centre go reasonably underwater. Power issues can also be a big thing, and all of these things are hard to protect against. I've seen a very well-built data center with UPS, with generator, properly built, be affected. This was a one based in Manchester where some builders managed to put a giant digger through some of the mains input cables.
Wow.
But they didn't actually cut the cable. They kind of shorted across it, and the generators spun up as they were supposed to do. but because the mains input hadn't been properly cut, the generators are designed to sync with the mains input, which they couldn't do. And they tried to do this for a couple of minutes until the batteries ran out on the UPS. So what should have been a very well-built data center did go offline, and they had massive issues recovering from that. But at the same time, you do get the human factor. We all know change control. We know what it's there to protect against. Still, mistakes happen. Sometimes things don't work in the way that people intended. Sometimes something that should have happened in dev happened in prod. Sometimes it was all approved correctly, all the commands were right, and there was a typo. You also have automated systems, so Chef or Puppet, where something has not been correctly input to them, and they'll go and break multiple systems. They're not as exciting, but all of these things you need to have a way of protecting yourself and a way of recovering. So that's one of the having good backups is the easiest and most efficient way of doing that typically.
Yeah. So why should data backup and protection, or data availability as I should be referring to it, why should this be high up on an organization's agenda?
I think the easy answer is that it doesn't matter what industry you're now working in, you have a significant reliance on IT. It doesn't matter what you do, whether you be transport or manufacturing or even farming. A friend of mine worked at a strawberry farm in their IT support department, and it was a hugely complex organization. And the reason for that is all of their markets, the suppliers and the large retail organizations, the Tesco and the Asda's, they wanted that end-to-end traceability of exactly what they were buying from, quality-based, and they wanted that audit trail. So this particular farm, through their data, could tell you which person picked it, the strawberries came from what section of the farm, even down to the individual field. So you've got all these industries, they're generating data at a level like never before. So there's huge amounts of data being generated, and it's not always in the traditional, this is in a database or whatever. Big data is becoming more of a thing, a lot of unstructured data. And businesses are having a challenge in organizing that data, making sure that it's available to the people that need it, obviously retaining data. There is a cost in doing so. And then you've also got the things like data legislation becoming a factor.
Yeah.
So GDPR being one of them, the right to be forgotten. How do you handle somebody giving you a request like that within your production data, but also across your backup data? So data organization is becoming a massive thing. Obviously, Veeam sort of specialize in the backup side of things, and they are starting to take these things into account. So they have various technologies built in to their product for dealing with obviously the immediate backup restore, the generic, what everybody does, but also how do you handle the longer term retention? So different companies handle that in different ways. Some just back everything up over a very short period of time. Some back just their critical servers up, and others, they're not so bothered. Some will back everything up for a short period of time and then filter down, so it's a smaller subset for the data that's kept around longer. Typically, financial organizations are keeping data for at least 7 years. Yeah. And going back to sort of the amount of data that they're generating from all of those locations, the data growth is exploding. So one of the technologies that Veeam recently released, which I was waiting for as a customer before Xtravirt, was the integration with AWS S3. Right. So you can have your backups stored on-prem for your day-to-day, your ease of restore things, and then the older backups, as they age out, Veeam can now automatically push that into AWS S3 buckets or Azure Blob. So it's a nice, easy way of handling those much larger data challenges or backup data challenges.
Yeah. So you mentioned GDPR and data legislation. How can you deal with that when you're dealing with DR? So
regulations kick in a number of places. So GDPR obviously is the one that had the headlines predominantly last year. So Veeam have got an interesting way of dealing with this. So mentioned right to be forgotten. One of the ways that Veeam can handle that is obviously if somebody does want to be forgotten, you need to remove that data entry or the various bits of data from your systems. Veeam have a way of doing a staged restore, so you can do a restore into a location, remove the data that's required, and then restore back into production.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you can very easily move things around to AWS and I think you mentioned Azure as well.
Yep.
In the era of like multi-cloud and hybrid cloud, how easy is it to keep all your data in one place backed up, when you're trying to claw it from all across the internet?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure it kind of makes sense where keeping it all in a single place, possibly a single tool set. I asked this question with some of the Vanguards and nobody could come up with an answer, but one of the statements that Veeam pioneered, I asked whether it was Veeam that actually came up with it or whether they've just embraced it, was Veeam have a generic rule that they call the 3-2-1 rule. And what that means is they want 3 copies of your data on 2 different medium or media. So that might be your disk-based and a tape-based mechanism with one of them off-site. So what Veeam have introduced in the tool set, so they came from very much a hypervisor-based backup tool. So they originally only supported the VMware ecosystem.
Yeah.
That was where they came from. That's the sort of longest-serving source of production data. They then introduced Hyper-V at a later date. I think next they then started supporting physical servers, so a Windows and Linux-based system. Around last year, they introduced the Nutanix Acropolis hypervisor as a source, and they've also introduced Amazon EC2 and AWS as sources. So potentially having one tool that manages all of your data, Veeam would argue they've got a solution to that because they've got the major hypervisors, the major operating systems, the major clouds covered, and they also handle Office 365 data, so your typical email or SharePoint, Microsoft technologies. So most enterprises, doesn't matter what your production is, Veeam have probably got an answer for backing it up.
Brilliant. So yeah, modern era, well and truly ticked off. That's what we like to hear. There are a number of vendors and tools available in the marketplace. As an expert in Veeam and a Veeam Vanguard, what do they offer for organizations?
So there are a number of tools and they all have pros and cons. They all do things slightly differently. I think Veeam have probably got the best overall product at the moment. They handle, as I alluded to, all of the major operating systems and hypervisors in a fairly easy to deploy, easy to manage, easy to scale way. There are some specialist tools on the market for potentially DR, so VMware's SRM being one of them, Zerto being another. There are also other backup tools, but I would say Veeam is the most complete product at the moment in this space.
Okay, so it's really that it offers the most bang for buck, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, so they do offer coverage of almost all of the major products in the market. I think probably the only one that you could argue that they don't support is GCP, Google's cloud. Mm-hmm. But I think if you look at their traditional customer base, enterprise or large businesses, they probably wouldn't have a huge uptick if they added that into the mix.
Do you reckon that'll change with the introduction of Anthos, or do you reckon that's a bit too early to tell?
So that's also an interesting one. So as the whole industry is looking more at container-based systems, the question of data management for containers is quite a good one. And I'm not sure it's a solved thing. I'm by no means a container expert, but I think most of the general advice at the moment is that containers are effectively stateless. If you have a database or another server of some function, you need to keep the persistent data outside of that, whether that be on a NAS or some other way. And Veeam kind of do have an answer for that. If it's a sort of file level backup, that can be done, or that's soon to be released. But the container industry, it's moving so fast that it's certainly not a solved solution at the moment.
Okay, that's interesting. Fantastic. So you're a Veeam Vanguard, and you've been one for a few years now?
Yes, I think this is my third year of being a Veeam Vanguard.
You're in your third year, so I'm guessing you're enjoying it. What kind of benefits do you find that you get being one of these? How does it help you in your day-to-day?
Sure. So I've been a member of a number of sort of industry advocacy programs. The VMware vExpert is the longest running one. I was also a Nutanix NTC for a year. Veeam Vanguard's quite different. It's a very, very small community run from one of the Veeam sort of technical marketing departments. The person that started it, or the person within Veeam that wanted it took a very interesting tack on it. His argument was always, if I don't know the names of the people, the program's got too big. So it's kept at very, very small scale. We get regular feedback from Veeam themselves as to sort of the direction we're going. There's a good community of very friendly people that you can bounce ideas off, whether that be problems or design sort of options, I suppose, design review maybe.
Yeah.
And that doesn't have to be in the Veeam world, but that's where it tends to sit around. It's Veeam or virtualization specific generally, but a very friendly bunch. But the really interesting thing that I think sets it apart is the access that we've had into Veeam's R&D. So last year we were actually all sent out to Prague, which is one of their major R&D offices, and we actually sat with some of the development team or some of the leaders, and they showed us some of their products that in some cases were a significant amount of time out from being announced, even internally within Veeam, which is quite a weird place to be.
Yeah.
But they were potentially talking about design criteria or options, or potentially we have enough development time to do one of these options. What do you think would be the best? And they give us input. I mean, they don't always listen to us, but we give them sort of real world feedback of what our pain points are, or potentially if they're bringing in a new feature, how something we would like it to work, or how if it was designed like this, it would solve a problem we've got. And there's a lot of experience within the sort of Vanguard community of people running things in different ways. So I used to work at a service provider that offered Veeam, and then there were some from some very large organizations that are doing some really innovative stuff with it. But also there were some very, very small users that didn't have a big estate to talk about, but they were very passionate about Veeam. They were interested in the direction it's going, and everybody had an input into things, and it was all taken on board.
Yeah.
You don't seem to get such a close alignment with the larger programs.
So that's cool. I mean, basically, it's still a small community, and you get lots of internal spoilers. I mean, by the sounds of things, you know more than some of the Veeam guys, which is that's got to be a nice feeling.
So I'm not sure on the exact timings, but in some cases, I think we had information 12 months ahead of some Veeam staff.
Wow. As a scheme goes, that's pretty impressive stuff.
Yeah. So what we saw was design mock-ups. There's no real working code or working software, but this was pie in the sky, what they were looking to do right on the edge of their sort of development roadmap.
Yeah.
As I say, I believe that's quite unique. I'm not familiar with a program that gives you that sort of, well, both trust and sort of insight into where they're going.
Yeah. So evidently you'd recommend people to the Veeam Vanguard scheme.
Absolutely.
How would someone go about becoming a Veeam Vanguard?
So I would say there is a reasonably high barrier to entry, but basically it's be passionate about Veeam. The way that I got entry is I was a founding member of the Veeam user group in the UK. Some people have presented on sort of Veeam deployments or things like that. Other people's blog about it. Some people have written some code, whether that be PowerShell or some API stuff. I know a couple of people that have done sort of blogs on data analysis. So one of the recent UK Veeam Vanguards took all of the different backup settings that exist within Veeam when you're backing up a VMware estate and took a production set of data, a live set of VMs, and then backed it up multiple different times so that it was the exact same source, which was a real world source. It wasn't fake. And then looked at all the different storage technologies at the back end and analysed the performance ingestion into the backup platform, but then also how the different storage efficiency mechanisms worked, whether that be compression or deduplication, and he did a big analysis piece on that, and that was one of the pieces of work that he used to become a Vanguard this year.
Awesome. So it's karma based almost, you know. You do nice things and you
Exactly.
You get in.
So he kind of wanted this data because he's sizing some pretty big Veeam estates for some large customers. So it was useful for him, but he just took it that sort of extra step and sort of published the real world data. And he came and did a talk about it at the Veeam user group, which was brilliant.
Amazing. So, is there anything that I've missed out? Is there anything where I interrupted you and you had something more to say?
I don't think.
Well, thank you very much. If anyone had any questions around data backup, disaster recovery, or is maybe interested in becoming a Veeam Vanguard, would they be able to reach out to you? And if so, how would they do that?
Absolutely. Probably the best way to find me is on Twitter. I'm at JamesKilbyNet.
At JamesKilbyNet. Thanks very much. That was absolutely great.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much. Chat soon.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Cloud Insiders. To find out more and to listen to additional episodes, go to cloudinsiders.fm. You can follow us on Twitter at Cloud Insiders and subscribe on iTunes. Catch you next time.